Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's panel discussion, VC Insights, Trends, and Opportunities in Women's Health Tech. My name is Michelle Romer-Schoen, and I am the Events Manager for Princeton Innovation Center Biolabs. I am here with my colleague Lauren Bender of the Princeton Entrepreneurship Council, and we would like to thank you for attending today's event. I know you will find it interesting. Princeton Innovation Center Biolabs opened for business in 2018 with the mission to foster innovation, collaboration, and entrepreneurship in New Jersey. We have over 30,000 square feet of laboratories, meeting rooms, offices, and co-working space, and we are here to make it easier for new science-based companies to get started and grow. The co-host for today's event is the Princeton Entrepreneurship Council of Princeton University. The mission of the Princeton Entrepreneurship Council is to engage the Princeton entrepreneurial ecosystem through education, mentoring, and funding. Big thanks to the Princeton Entrepreneurship Council staff for their work in bringing today's event to fruition. We've been in the world of virtual events for long enough. I'm sure you know how the logistics work. If you have a question for our panelists, please type it in the Q&A section at the bottom of your screen. If you're having technical issues with the webinar, please let us know about it using the chat section. You can also use the chat section to let other attendees know you are here. Also, today's event is being recorded and will be made available for viewers to watch at their convenience. Now, I would like to introduce the moderator for our panel today. Nishta Rao is currently Managing Director at First Republic Bank, where she is responsible for the growth and expansion of the bank's life science vertical. Prior to this, Nishta was Managing Director of Biolabs at NYU Langone, where she supported the translation of technologies into commercially viable products and therapies. In addition, she also launched and led Princeton Innovation Center Biolabs as the inaugural director. Nishta, a molecular biologist by training, has scientific experience both in academia and industry. She also serves as a mentor to several startup companies in the life science and healthcare space. At this point, I will hand things over to Nishta and let her introduce you to the panelists. Thank you again for attending today's event. I hope you enjoy the discussion.
Thank you so much, Michelle. Welcome everyone to the VC Insights, Trends and Opportunities in Women's Health Tech panel. First of all, I'm absolutely thrilled to be back at the Princeton Innovation Center Biolabs, or at least be back virtually to moderate a panel on what I think is an immensely important and relevant topic. There are a few things that the COVID-19 pandemic has shown us with regard to healthcare. And a couple of things being the inequities we suffer on the basis of geography, race, and gender. And the other being the different ways in which men and women are affected by certain disease states. We have an all-star panel here to discuss all of this and much, much more. But before we get into introductions, a massive thanks to both PICB and PEC for organizing this event. It's always such a pleasure to work with you and to be involved in your ecosystem. And now for an introduction to our esteemed panelists, Linda Grube, Karen Drexler, and Laura Yeses. You are all leaders in this space. So if you could tell us a little bit about yourselves, expanding on your current role to kick things off, that would be great. Linda, let's start with you.
I'm Linda Grube. I'm one of the founders of Avestria Ventures. We invest in early stage women's health companies and female-founded life science ventures. And we're based in the San Francisco Bay Area, but our companies are all over the country.
Thank you, Linda. Karen?
Hi, thanks for having me here. I'm a proud Princeton alum and have been focused in the medical device space since graduating from Princeton with a chemical engineering degree. I've spent most of my career as an entrepreneur working in healthcare. One of the areas of focus for me has been women's health. At the current time, I've got a series of activities. I'm an active board member on 6 different companies, 4 of which are led by women, and am active with a group called Astio, which focuses on supporting and investing in female founders across different sectors. So look forward to chatting with the panelists and fielding your questions.
Thank you, Karen and Laura.
Hi, everyone. My name is Laura Yeeses, and I'm the CEO of Bone Health Technologies. I'm not a Princeton alumna, but my son and daughter-in-law went to Princeton, so very happy to participate in any Princeton events. Let's see, I have worked in the tech world for the first 25 years of my career, consumer and enterprise software. And then for the last 5 years, have worked in health tech. Most recently, I was CEO of a diagnostic company in the concussion space. But I was really excited to join Bone Health Technologies almost a year ago as CEO, because we're working on what is one of the biggest unsolved healthcare issues that we're facing as a society today. It's a problem that's particularly acute for women that have osteoporosis, although it affects men as well. And so we have a device that's currently undergoing a pivotal trial that uses targeted vibration therapy to treat osteopenia and hopefully prevent osteoporosis. And look forward to talking about how that fits into the scheme of things during this panel.
Thank you so much, Laura. And also, just wanted to mention that you were just awarded a $2.7 million grant from the NIH. So huge congratulations on that.
Thank you. Yeah, we just announced that yesterday. The National Institute of Aging, which is part of the NIH, awarded us this grant to advance the commercialization and an additional clinical trial of our device. So we're really thrilled about that. And I think the government is recognizing Medicare is footing the bill for a lot of these fractures. So it's an important problem.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So let's start from the very beginning here. This is relatively a new subcategory in our healthcare space, even though the unmet medical need is definitely not a novel one. So just for the purpose of, educating the audience and other folks that are probably going to look at this after we finish and this is going to be recorded, how would you define women's health, or FemTech, as some people like to call it, and just the importance of it? So Linda, if we could start with you and then go to Karen and also Laura after that.
So when we say that we invest in women's health companies, we define women's health as any thing that impacts women exclusively, predominantly, or differently. So examples for that are exclusively childbirth, menopause. Predominantly Alzheimer's disease or autoimmune disease predominantly impact women. And then differently, cardiovascular disease is the #1 killer of women, and yet symptoms for women are very different than symptoms for men. Colorectal cancer, thyroid cancer, different symptoms and different treatments for men and women. So we think of it as anything where your biological sex means that you'll experience a disease in a different way than the other biological sex.
Thanks so much, Linda. So it kind of really broadens the scope. Karen, from your perspective.
Yeah, and I really prefer to use the term women's health rather than femtech, because I find that a lot of people, when talking about femtech, focus on those things that only happen in women and often focus on the reproductive system. Whereas, as Linda mentioned, there's so many other issues. Virtually everything is presented differently in women. We react to drugs differently. There's a larger chromosomal difference between women and men than between female monkeys and female humans. So, across species, the sex difference, biological sex, makes a huge difference. And we talk about how important a single gene pair can be in our reaction to a drug and customizing medication. But for the longest time, we didn't even bother with the notion that a whole chromosome different could make a difference in our health. So I think it is important to have the bigger conversation. And those are many of the areas which are still lacking in attention and funding, which I'm sure we'll get into.
Yeah.
And I won't add or change the definition, because I agree with what was stated before. I'll just say that I think my company and osteoporosis is a really good example of kind of this current definition on the table of women's health. So, half of all women will have a fracture from osteoporosis, 1 in 4 men. Menopause dramatically changes the bone metabolism for women. And so, in fact, hormone replacement therapy can be a treatment for osteoporosis, and that wouldn't be done typically for men. That being said, our current clinical trial is in postmenopausal women, but we are hopeful that our device could eventually be used for both, because there's still an important unmet need for men as well.
Yeah, no, that's fascinating, because I think, like all of you echoed, it isn't just a small section that, of disease or of unmet medical needs that we're dealing with. This expands much more to things like heart, diabetes, bone health. So I think that's something that's really important to put out there in terms of how broad this field is. So, just kind of pivoting a little bit in terms of, yes, there's a ton of emerging technologies that are coming out. But I was just wondering, in terms of your perspective, and Laura, we could start with you. What has the impact of COVID-19 been on women's health? What have you seen?
Well, I think COVID-19 has impacted across the board. So I don't know if it impacts women's health more, but I think it has, it's a time of change. Change allows for innovation. And so you have, I think, this, the fact that everything is kind of on the table and processes are being looked at differently, home-based treatments, telehealth, more use of technology. I think that this environment of innovation and change is a great environment for women's health, and frankly, all innovators.
No, absolutely. And just in terms of, this explosion in digital health, telehealth, Linda and Karen, have you seen, in terms of the adoption of existing solutions in the women's health space, has that now been accelerated as well?
So I think it's really important for everyone to know that previously you would not, if you were a physician, you would not necessarily be reimbursed for doing a phone call or a video call with a patient. And just recently, as a result of COVID, there are now codes in place. So physicians can charge for and be reimbursed for the digital interaction. So that's a huge change. That's made telemedicine, from something that was maybe a nice to have for someone who could pay for it out of pocket to something that really can be adopted throughout the country.
It's important to note that there's nothing about technology that wasn't available 10 years ago to enable telehealth. So telehealth has been around. It's been a very marginal thing that patients weren't comfortable using and doctors weren't comfortable doing. Also, as Linda highlighted, doctors weren't being paid for doing. And with COVID, it's accelerated at least a decade, in my view. And we've seen changes that some thought might be temporary, but customers like it. I've had a few telehealth visits, and if I don't need to go into the doctor's office, I'd rather do it. What's been most striking to me in the women's health area is there are some areas where there was an activity before. There was an assumption that, for example, if you were doing well visits during a pregnancy, you had to see the doctor. And COVID has really made it so we take technologies we already have, off-the-shelf blood pressure cuffs and weight scales, and combine that with telehealth. And all of a sudden, women who are pregnant don't have to go in and expose themselves to COVID in order to get a prenatal visit. So there are areas in women's health that people thought those will never be virtual, that have embraced virtual visits because of some of these changes that COVID has driven.
Yeah, no, absolutely. We've seen that, in every aspect of life, but definitely that's great that it's also happening in the women's health space, and hopefully that will, increase adoption as well.
Well, and also think about just the connections that can be made. So, early osteoporosis or osteopenia is generally treated by primary care, so internist, OBGYN. But, if someone is advanced or they're not responding well to treatment, they're typically referred to an endocrinologist. Well, there's only 8,000 of them in the US. It is not so easy to get an appointment with an endocrinologist, but they don't probably need to see the patient in person. The labs can be ordered, the bone density testing can be ordered in another place, and then you could, have a matching that's possible online of the need by the patient and the expert, that can really be impactful.
No, absolutely.
And in turn, it's really changing, I think, when we're seeing where strategic large corporations are making some investments, and part of where we're seeing innovation is there's more and more for at-home monitoring, right? And I don't know how many of these will be successful, but we're seeing a lot of companies where the idea is to, take a measurement at home, do a monitoring at home, send the information for the doctor, and there are codes in place where the doctor can get paid for looking at what is, the data that the monitor is submitting.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think, just looking at the big picture and how things can come together, I think that is very helpful. So just, talking about the investment side, we all know there's a huge market for this, right? Women are about 50% of the global population. The market in FemTech revenue in 2019 was over 600 million and is expected to be about 1.1 billion by 2024, according to a report that was published in Frost and Sullivan. So despite this 500 billion in annual medical expenses that are attributed to women, it's just 4% of healthcare research and development that are targeted specifically to women's health issues. So just looking at it, a little bit historically, why do you think this is? What are the barriers that we are overcoming, but we still need to? Laura, it'd be great if we start from the company side and then go to Linda and Karen from the investment side.
So the first thing that went through my mind when you asked that question, Nisha, was what should that number be, right? It's pretty obvious that 4% isn't enough, but it also is pretty obvious that it doesn't need to be 50% because not everything is specific to women. So I don't know what numbers is correct or success, but one thing that I can say in terms of the why is people are interested, generally speaking, in things that they personally connect to. I'll just give you an example. My late father-in-law was an allergist. Well, and he had terrible allergies, and he lived in Stockton where there's a ton of pollen, right? And he could connect with his patients there. There was a study that I think it was Harvard Business Review, but it was definitely a Harvard Business School professor analyzed patents. And the patents filers are generally working on things that relate to their gender. So the fact that there's a lot more men who are in fields for whatever reason that they will, and patents are sort of a proxy for, innovation or some of this activity. To me, that's kind of gets to the why, right? So I think if there are more women who are in these fields and starting companies, some of that is the skills, some of that is access to capital. It's obviously a complex issue, but they're attracted and motivated to work on these problems. I am not a founder of Bone Health Technology, but I got really excited about getting involved with a company because it was something that I connected to. I see this hopefully in my distant, but in my future.
Yeah, absolutely. That makes a lot of sense. Linda?
Well, I disagree a little bit with what Laura said in terms of, I don't think it's necessarily a matter that women aren't starting companies. That's absolutely not what we're seeing. I mean, we see so many female entrepreneurs who are out there innovating and starting their own companies, right? I think that, I think there are structural issues in our society where, I mean, there's in no way does it make any sense to me that only 4% of funding is going towards women's health, right? And I think it's so much a matter of who are the people who are making decisions at large organizations, right? And I think that until you have diverse groups of people at the head of all these organizations, things will not change. So I think it's a bit more of a problem than women not leaning in, for instance.
Oh, so I just want to clarify that I agree that they're leaning in now, but if the current spend is reflective of 50 years of business activity, then maybe 20 years, you know what I mean? This isn't all from a point in time. I agree with you. The women are trying to do it now.
Certainly when I was starting companies early on in my career, I would go into meetings, whether it was industry conferences, investor meetings, whatever, and be one of two women in a group of 200, 500 participants. So there certainly has been a shift over time. In some ways, though, just chiming in, I think the problem is even bigger. Yes, we have an issue with the funders, in that most venture funders are male. Most women CEOs, on average, raise a lot less money than men, because they tend to go to different sources. They need to, because that's where they get response. But even looking back to academic research and things that might feed into companies at some point, you look at government funding, and if you listen in to congressional discussions about healthcare, the amount of misinformation, complete bogus information that's out there about women's health is incredible. And until recently, most of our government, it's still most, but our government was largely run by men. And when they thought about healthcare, they thought about things that were important to them. So the amount of funding that's gone into erectile dysfunction versus making sure that the US is anywhere near world class in terms of keeping women alive as they deliver babies. And it's day and night. We are one of the worst countries in the world in terms of maternal outcomes in this rich country with tons of money flowing into healthcare, but not going to maternal health. So there are systematic issues that go all the way through this that have been around for a long time. We're inching forward, but there's still a huge gap to close.
So that's actually a fascinating discussion right here in terms of what is the life cycle of a company that's working on women's health. What does that look like? So, you are going to get the initial amounts of funding. So that would be the seed, the angel funding, right? And Linda and Karen, you are very much involved in that space. And then what happens? Like you have that initial round that a company gets, and then you have, some grant money that could come in. What's the next step?
I think there's a step before that first step, right? You need entrepreneurs to oftentimes be able to have that sweat equity founding stage. So to have something that's fundable.
Mm-hmm.
And how, and just, since you bring that up, Laura, just in terms of the, from the investment side, from the fundability side, are you now seeing more companies with high, potential technologies coming through that, that can be funded, that are fundable?
So just one data point. When we started Avestria, and Fund One was started in 2019, one of the questions that some of our early LPs asked is, well, you're looking for female founders, and it's going to be early stage, and it's going to be women's health. Are you going to find enough things to invest in? And I'll just say that, it seems like a pretty specific universe that we're looking for. And we've interacted with over 800 companies in the last 2 years, right? there are plenty of innovations and plenty of entrepreneurs. How many will succeed is a whole nother story, but there is a lot out there.
I agree. Anytime a venture investor says to me, well, we haven't funded women because we don't get the deal flow, there's something broken in their deal flow. There is no problem accessing high quality, great ideas, great entrepreneurs. But the next stage has been problematic for many of our companies because we find that with Avestria, with other funds that are emerging, many of them are still on the smaller side and are doing the early stage funding. You don't have the mega funds in place yet that are dominated by female partners that focus on health or women's health. They're in other areas. And we often find companies are really stuck at the Series A or Series B level when they're looking to raise 7 million, 15 million, 20 million. It's hard to find those investors to take those companies to the next stage. So we find ourselves, obviously cheering for Linda and her partners to raise more funds and bigger funds. And at Astia, we're in the process of closing on a $100 million fund that's meant as a follow-on fund, not only in women's health, but all focused on women. But we need more of these because although this has been a hot topic and there have been a lot of funds now that are in the space, they tend to be very early stage.
And
if you look at the big health tech exits, they at some point usually raise substantial amounts of capital, right?
Yep.
There's the early capital, there's the big exit, and then there's usually a pretty significant growth round or Series B or C where they're raising multiple tens of millions, even hundreds of millions. And so that needs to be in place, to see the kinds of, the Livongos or, One Medicals or, some of these big exits that we all believe are possible.
Yeah, and I think that's the measure of success as well, right? From an investor's point of view, if you're looking at from the big Series C or folks that are going to come in later on, I mean they're going to drive a company towards an exit.
Well, and the exits feed the startups, right?
Yes.
So a story I've told before is, and it actually happened with Astia. So Bone Health Technologies was pitching Astia, and we had interest, and we had an investment coming together. And as we were going through that process, I wasn't on the Astia side, but I guess they were all discussing and looking. Alydia exited, and Alydia was an Astia portfolio company, and suddenly the amount that wanted to get invested into my company was larger. And what I learned was that it was the same people, right? They had an exit, they had a women's health, FemTech, whatever you want to call it, win. And they're like, we're staying in this area. And of course, they have the capital to do it with. So the exits feed the beginning of the cycle too.
Yeah. We're actually getting a few questions from the audience. So let's just look very quickly. Somebody said, do you think that closing the investment gap needs to be addressed by policy, or will it naturally close as FemTech companies grow and succeed?
I think it has to be addressed. I think the best place it can be addressed is, so I'm sure everyone knows that institutional investors, the vast majority of assets are managed by institutional investors. And most institutional investors want to invest with fund managers who have at least a 10-year track record and are on fund 10 or above, right? And most of those, the vast majority of those are run by men, right? So women, in order to become a partner in a venture fund, are finding that they have to start their own funds, right? And when you start your own fund, it doesn't matter if you're male or female, it's going to be a long time before you have that 10-year track record, right? So I think, and you're less risky, right? And that the institutional money will be willing to invest in you. And so I think one of the questions that was asked about a year ago by a couple of congressmen to a number of the endowment funds, what percentage of your endowment assets are being managed by female managers, females or minorities, right? And they went to 25 universities. And unfortunately, my alma mater couldn't answer the question. They were unable to come up with the number. And the numbers were probably better than I thought they were going to be. Globally, the number is 1%, but the endowments were coming up with numbers like 5%, right? I think that my biggest hope is that alumni will start talking to their alma maters and saying, just tell us, where are you investing these funds, right? Are they going to female and minority managers, right? And are they investing in a diverse group? And in fact, it doesn't matter who the manager is, are they making a diverse set of investments? And I think that that has to change. And whether that's policy or not, I think that needs to change before we'll have any significant change in funding.
And Linda, we've seen it on the public company side, right? With whether it's the public trusts that are investing, where the entire category of diversity and inclusion is a big issue for shareholders, management, or board members will be voted out if the companies don't behave, but it hasn't trickled down into the private realm. But and to make it happen in the public realm, to some degree, there has been legislation, states like California, that mandate the number of female and minority directors that need to be on boards. It's been hard to move the needle without some of those mandates.
So we're getting a few questions here, so I'll just try and run through some of them because they're really interesting. Are larger healthcare companies beginning to invest in this space, or only those companies that are already focused on women's health issues?
So right now there are, so Hologic has always been focused on women's health. And then Cooper Surgical has a large presence in women's health. What's interesting is Merck this past year put all their women's health assets into one entity, and it's Organon, and they spun it out. So it's a publicly traded standalone company. So that's great to see, a management team that's fully devoted on trying to improve women's health. Even within Philips Healthcare, there's more focus on women's health recently.
And Organon, the company that Linda just mentioned, is the company that acquired Alydia, which is the company that Laura had mentioned. So they're already in the acquisition mode, which is great. It's very encouraging to see that. There have been other companies that have divested their women's health portfolios, though. So I'm not sure net we're anywhere that we're ahead. So it is a strategic initiative for some companies, but other companies have really gotten out of it. There have been a lot of issues with litigation on things like mesh and breast implants. It's an expensive category. If you're in an area where you could potentially impact women's health and babies' health, then that's scary for a lot of companies, and they just don't want to participate. So it's a mix.
I know for osteoporosis, the pipeline of drugs is quite thin. There are not, I think, currently any late stage trials. So,
Laura, why do you think that's the case?
I think two reasons. One is that for drugs, and there's some good reason for this, but it's had some bad consequences, is they require fracture studies, not just bone density, right? And so it's like 10 years to get good fracture data. And so those studies just become very, very expensive. And then the current medications aren't selling that well. So I think it's at the intersection of those two. It's certainly not for, lack of potential patients. It's actually a question I'm looking more into, but that's kind of what I've been hearing so far. Now, the reason for the need to do fracture studies is some of the first couple of medications for osteoporosis, they were taken up in the bone, but they led to more brittle bones, and in the end they were not good. So, so that was a good reason. Fortunately for our product, our safety profile is such that we are just for our clearance, we'll just need to show bone density. But of course, we're going to collect real world evidence around fracture.
Yeah.
And part of the reason that the current drugs aren't well utilized or aren't as well utilized as you might expect is because they do have some nasty side effect profiles that women are getting more and more, patients in general, but women in particular in this case, are more and more aware of. I should have mentioned at the beginning, one of the boards that I'm on is actually Laura's. I'm on the bone health board. And just like it's of interest to her, I have a family history of bone loss and expect that I'll be in the same situation, and I just don't want to take these drugs. So I want Laura's solution to be on the market. And if I can help make that happen, that's where I'm going to put my time.
So Karen, a question for you then, and it's actually a question from one of our audience members as well, Jill Barron. I wonder if you are at liberty to say how your company's technology differs from other vibrational technologies, for which I believe there are mixed results. Does your technology treat the spine, hip, and the wrist? Thank you very much.
So as a board member, we have the CEO here, and she's the one who should answer that question. But hi, Jill. I'm really glad you're here.
So I'll say two things. The vibration research that has the best results was that done by NASA. And there were 15 peer-reviewed papers published on it, including in Nature. So I actually think that there is some quite good data. Now, what was shown in the data is that the results were only good for those who were able to be highly compliant with the treatment. And, that's not really a surprise. If you don't use it, it's not going to work for you. And so the design of our device is very much focused on ease of use and the ability for patients to be compliant. Instead of standing on a platform, platforms are very expensive. You have to do nothing. You have to have your knees locked. You put on the belt and, you can use the device. And of the range of vibration devices, we are using the specific, frequency and amplitude that had the best results, as well as being safe in a clinical trial. In terms of parts of the body, our belt is worn at the sacrum. So we're looking for it to improve bone density in the hips and lumbar spine. So it doesn't work on the wrist right now. But if we are able to show efficacy here, there's no theoretical reason why it couldn't work on other parts of the body, and we could do other devices. We chose the hips and lumbar spine because hip fractures are deadly. Wrist fractures are very, very inconvenient and painful, but not deadly. And lumbar spine fractures are the most common. So that was the reason for our focus on that part of the body.
Great. Thank you, Laura. There's another audience question, Prashant. Is mental health significantly different for women? I don't know if someone wants to start that answer. Karen, Linda, are you seeing companies that are coming to you specifically in this space?
One area where I'm seeing companies is in the postpartum area, which obviously only affects women and is largely and completely unaddressed. So that's an example of a place where mental health is very, very different and has not been addressed as a women's issue. I'm not an expert in this space. Again, Linda may be able to jump in here, but I've also seen companies that try to address, for many women, there's more variation based on hormonal cycling that can impact depression and other aspects that isn't recognized in a generalized solution.
Thank you. Yes, definitely. That definitely makes sense. Laura, for you, question. How can we improve the visibility of companies with Series A and B funders? We have an audience member asking that.
You mean getting the companies on the radar of the investors?
Yes.
Well, Laura,
that's a good question because, historically, it was kind of old boys and connections, right? Like you would want an intro or personal connection to a VC. And so I think that has been a challenge for some women. So, events like this, and maybe not even exactly this, but for instance, I participated a few weeks ago in a women's health innovation forum. Linda was involved with that. I think those kinds of events give more visibility to companies. But that's a good question. I don't know, maybe Linda from the other side or Karen of the table of how you source deals, how to get more visibility. I think in the end, it's the networks, right? Like helping to foster more connections.
Yeah, I mean, I think a big part of my responsibility that I need to spend ever more time on is developing the connections with the funders who are going to lead the next rounds for our companies, right? Because that I think is part of my responsibility as well. And so it's making sure that I have strong networks and I can really, articulate to another investor why this is an amazing investment opportunity, right? Because that's, our jobs when we do early stage investing is to help de-risk the company, because when you de-risk a company, then more investors will be attracted to it, and it will raise more capital.
There are also accelerator, incubator, pick your term. There are a zillion of these programs out there, and some of them do a particularly good job of having demo days, of getting investors to the table to see the companies that are in their portfolios. But you need to be really careful when you're thinking about joining these incubators. They can be real time sinks, and some of them add real value. Some of them charge a lot of money to participate in them. So there's a whole variety of different options. But again, some of them do provide access to an investor community.
Yeah. So I think that brings us to a question that I had, but also somebody in the audience has. What would you tell someone that wants to start a company in this space? If you were to give them a couple of nuggets of advice, what would that be? So maybe, Laura, we'll start with you, since you're actually, doing this in real time. What would you say?
Well, I think two of the biggest challenges or problems that early stage companies get into, and I've had this too, so this is kind of like a hard won lesson, is you fall in love with the problem yourself, right? And you see it as a big issue, and you can write a whole PowerPoint presentation, give a whole, whatever on why it's a big problem. And like, you have to be too convincing, and I think being really honest with yourself of, do the people that you think have the problem, are they motivated to change, right? Because getting change, especially medical practice, is very difficult. Right? Those practice patterns, those workflows are hard to change. And so to get them to change, there has to be really significant dissatisfaction, not just a little bit. Like if you're having to say, well, isn't it this sort of a problem, and wouldn't it be better with this? And if they like, oh yeah, maybe. No, that's not going to work. They have to be telling you, oh my God, I've been desperate for that. That is like the biggest challenge I have. And then it has to be impactful. So, what's going to change? And one of the things that I learned in my company that was in the diagnostic space, and diagnostics are so interesting. And there's really cool technology going on in them. But is the doctor or patient going to do something very different? And if yes, then it matters a lot. So anyhow, so really, I think honing in that problem and then thinking it all the way through. Who's going to pay? Is there willingness to pay by the end user, by the insurance company? How is it going to work from a business point of view? And I think it's very easy to be focused only on sort of that science, health, problem solution, but that still requires the business side.
Linda, your thoughts?
Oh, I think I mean, I'm an entrepreneur. I just started this fund a couple of years ago. And one of the things that I'm constantly having to do is ask for real feedback, right? And if you're meeting with someone, you, you know, try to make it more of a conversation instead of just a pitch, right? And make it so that it's easy for them to say, you might pause in your pitch and say, are there certain things that where you think, that I maybe need to, do you have questions about and you'd like me to expand on, right? And because we all only see the world with our limited perspective. And the more you can take honest feedback from all sorts of people, the better you'll be as an entrepreneur.
I'd add a couple of additional things. One is it's really hard to be an entrepreneur. It's really hard. It's a full-time, around-the-clock kind of activity. And we have seen that we here being Astia, that founders are much more successful in groups. So if you think you can do it by yourself and you've got nobody to talk to and bounce ideas off of, I mean, maybe you can. There certainly are examples of solo founders that have done well, but founding teams in general are of more interest, at least to the early stage investors that I'm around, because you need to spread the load. There's just a lot to do. And you're not going to be able to hire people to do all the different functions in an early stage company, but surround yourself with advisors who have expertise in different areas who can make you look bigger than you are and give you the opportunity to ask questions, get expertise in different areas, rather than walking in looking for investment as a single person, trying to answer every question about manufacturing and reimbursement and supply chain. It just isn't credible. So get yourself some help.
That is great advice, Megan. I hope that that helped in answering your question. We have another question from Gretchen. Upfront, we definitely define healthcare broadly, but in many companies, trends, women's health tends to focus on fertility. What areas do you think we are likely to see additional expansion or focus in the next few years? Go ahead.
I think the focus on women on reproductive health, on fertility, has been because it's something that hasn't been covered by insurance. It's been a huge cost. It can cost families $100,000 out of pocket to try to have a baby. It's one of those crazy areas of our healthcare. We view fertility as an optional thing, not as a necessity. And so we don't pay for it as part of our healthcare system for the most part. And so women started going to employers and basically insisting, if you don't help with this, I'm going to go find somebody who will. And that's really driven a lot of change in the fertility space, with employers starting in tech companies, but employers starting to foot the bill. There's a huge growth opportunity on the other end of the spectrum in menopause and some of the other areas. But a lot of those women are actually leaving the workforce and don't exert the same pressure on employers. So I don't really expect that change to come from employers being willing to cover things that are outside of a normal health plan. But it's certainly a huge opportunity, and there's a lot of activity now.
And one thing, we have spoken with a couple of companies who are working on the menopause space, and to the extent that we start recognizing that perimenopause starts well before menopause, right? That those women are employed, right? And so if you're going to do something in the menopause space, and you want to approach employers, you need to be thinking more about how do I engage these women as their estrogen levels are slowly dropping and it's impacting their lives, right? So more awareness, I think, would be helpful there.
Yeah, no, absolutely. So just, out of curiosity, actually, I was thinking about this. So I come from the therapeutic space. And in the therapeutic side, academia has a huge influence, or, technologies that have been spun out of academia, are getting more and more every single year. So I was just wondering, in terms of, the pipeline, where are these technologies coming from. Is there something that you see from academia as well? Laura, your perspective as well from, as a founder, where are these technologies coming from in the sense it's a personal connection, yes, but are you seeing also academia getting involved in this?
In my personal career history, it hasn't been very much out of academia, so I can't speak to that. For Bone Health Technologies, we spun out of an incubator that focuses exclusively on medical devices and has expertise there with all of the in-depth, various processes. And frankly, earlier in my career, when I was in tech, the innovations were coming out of the companies. So I'm not saying it's not important, but that's not been my personal focus. Even the early research on vibration technologies, there was some in academia at a cellular level, but once it was applied, it was more outside. That being said, our CTO, he got his PhD at Berkeley, and his research area was related to what we're doing. So the fact that he had that opportunity to pursue that academic program certainly played a role in our company.
I see a lot of companies that have a doctor as a co-founder. And so from that standpoint, many of them have an affiliation with an academic association, but it's not coming out of university research. It's coming out of their experience, whether it's because they learned something during surgery or interacting with patients in another way. There also are programs like the biodesign program. It started at Stanford, now is represented across the world in different institutions, that focuses on the how-to of developing medical devices. And that's been a huge influence in the medical device space, including spawning a whole bunch of companies in the women's health space. So it's more the availability of the training and the way of thinking. Berkeley has just defined this FAST program, which is now used by the NIH to train academic researchers. So there's a huge influence from academia, but the technology per se that I see doesn't come out of academia.
We've got a couple of our companies where they in-license the technology from academia, but that's maybe 20% of our portfolio companies. Yeah. So it matters. It depends.
Yeah. A question from Eve. How would you advise a venture working in an area of women's health that has a clear patient and physician unmet need, but relatively small market opportunity based on the women who are presently treated for the condition? However, if all women in need of the treatment could access it, this would change the economics. How would you approach this type of challenge? From the venture side,
so that all comes down to like how you're going to define what the market is, right? And if you believe that the condition is, it sounds like what you're saying is the condition is underdiagnosed, right? And we've invested in companies where their idea of the market size is actually pretty different than when you Google what's the incidence of this disease. And and they're good examples of when that's been successful. So it's part of that is thinking it through, having good data that can support it. Lydia Health, the one we've talked about, to stop they have a device to stop postpartum hemorrhaging. One of my concerns there was, that I think the data usually shows 2% of births involve postpartum hemorrhaging. So that seemed like a pretty small market to us. And then they were telling us, oh, it's 10%. And they had, we would talk through, like, is it really 10%? Is it really underdiagnosed? And they came up with very solid arguments. But one of the things that's different about it depends on what subsector you're in. But for instance, if you're a device, often device companies are acquired once they get FDA 510K approval, right? If you think that your market is substantially bigger than anybody else thinks, you're going to have to, in your own business plan, allow for funding where you're going to survive on your own long enough to show market traction, right? You're going to have to prove to someone that in fact it's been undiagnosed and more people are presenting once they get the treatment. So it doesn't mean it won't work. It means you're going to have to work a little harder to get funding, and you need to think about, in the go-to-market strategy, how are you going to convince, if it's something that clinicians prescribe, how are you going to convince clinicians that they need to think more broadly about who the target patient is?
It's also really important what kind of resources are going to be required to bring it to market. So if you've got a $500 million market and it's going to cost you $1 billion to develop whatever it is, that's a non-starter, right? Even if you think it could be a $10 billion market, as Linda said, you have to survive to the point where you can make the point. It's also going to affect the investors that you go after. So there are deals that Astia has invested in where the amount of money that was going to be required to bring something to market was relatively modest. $5 million, $10 million, where angel investors could cover the entire funding need. And if that company is acquired early, great. If it ends up showing that there's more of a market, great. But you're not going to get venture investors to invest in a company that has a relatively small market potential.
And also, what can you charge, right? I mean, the rare, from a therapeutic drug point of view, the rare disease market is booming, right? They're charging extremely high prices for small numbers of patients. However, those patients are very costly, and it actually can even be worthwhile for them to have a $250,000 gene therapy. I haven't seen that type of medical device, but it's not only quantity, it's also dollars per. Going back to Linda's point though about something being underdiagnosed, I want to kind of reinforce this idea that I think that you have this very iterative process of treatment drives diagnosis, which drives treatment, which drives diagnosis, right? So, in the case of osteopenia, plenty of women are not officially diagnosed because there's no treatment. So the doctors are going to essentially say, well, I can do an X-ray, I can do a DEXA scan and find out that, you're minus 1.5 T-score, and then I'll tell you to make sure you're getting enough calcium and weight-bearing exercise. So get enough calcium and weight-bearing exercise and come back when you're 65. Well, if there's a treatment, suddenly that whole calculus changes.
Yep. That is very true. So, Laura, you mentioned that you're in the middle of clinical trials and things like that. A question for you. I mean, women in clinical trials. I mean, that has been an issue till recently, right? In the sense, women being part of clinical trials. How has this progress? I mean, what are you seeing now in terms of diversity in clinical trials?
So, historically, there have been lots of issues around including women in drug clinical trials and, reasons for the hesitancy on the part of the pharmaceutical companies and legislative changes, and same thing for pediatrics. So I'm not an expert in that. There's been a lot of change, and it's been a big issue that we know about. And even for ethnic diversity, I mean, the Framingham study had almost no African Americans, and it turns out they were getting the wrong heart disease treatment. So it actually really matters clinically to have this diversity. I mean, for our device, we're only studying in women because our indication for use is postmenopausal women with a certain, threshold of bone density. But we did have, an expectation by the FDA to have ethnically representative patient population in our trial. And we worked really, really hard on that. I mean, we spent a lot of money trying to recruit a fully diverse patient pool, and we got part way there, but not all the way. And for that reason, we're actually going to be doing some additional studies in other geographic locations. But it's a challenging topic. It's some ethnic groups are, for historical reasons, hesitant to participate in trials. And so we have to work extra hard to overcome that. But I would say from a regulatory point of view, the FDA has an expectation of diversity.
And that's new.
It's new, and as I understand it, they don't require separate analysis by gender, which is still a problem because there are many, many cases where we see women have a different response, both to drugs and devices. An example in the device world is knee replacement, where men have virtually 100% positive outcome and women it's more like 75%, because the loading of weight in women's bodies, given the shape of our hips, is just different. And until recently, there was no requirement to even include women in trials, and now women can be 15% or 20% of a trial, not analyzed separately. It's still not going to show the issue. So this is not a solved problem.
Yeah, definitely an ongoing issue. And just, it also affects in terms of accumulation of data, right? If you're looking at historical data sets, I mean, they are definitely skewed. So, that is something I think there's still a ton of work that needs to be done.
And there are many, many companies now that are using AI as a technology, as a buzzword and or a technology to advance what they're doing and get funded. And many of those data sets are very skewed. So AI learns from the data that you give it. If you give it bad data or not diverse data, you're going to end up with outcomes that aren't what you expect. So that's definitely an area companies that that have an AI component to their solutions need to be very careful about what they're inputting.
I can't believe it's already been an hour. I mean, there's still so many questions. So I think perhaps we could continue for a little bit, because I think there's a ton of audience engagement. There's a question here. Please advise as to how to move expertise from government health space, CDC, NIH, HHS, to VC health investing. Karen and Linda.
Yeah, I'm not sure I understand the question.
I mean, what we do, certainly VCs want any help they can get, right? We'll look for advisors any place they can. So if someone's a former FDA advisor, trust me, VCs would love to pay them to consult, right? So that's, I don't, and VCs are always hiring experts in different areas, because at least we know that we don't know what the experts do.
Yeah, and I think that's exactly right, because there's a follow-up question from Lucia that says, do most VCs see value in hiring women? What is the best way to show value?
Well, hiring women is
Yeah.
a whole
That's a
different
different
story.
story.
They make
that's
excellent HR administrators, or and
CFOs.
Yeah,
Marketing.
It's awful. We've gone from 95% of venture capital of the so there are different pockets within a venture capital firm, and generally people talk about the investment team and the operating team, right? And it's the investment team that gets paid the most amount of money, and they control the dollars. And it has gone from 95% all men down to only 87% all men. And I'm pretty sure if we look at that, the majority of that change, there are two things have made that change. One is more and more women are founding their own VC funds. So they're able to write checks themselves. The other thing too is we have seen more VC funds go out and hire a junior woman and put her onto the investment team, which is great, but it is going to take a while for those women to have voice within those organizations.
Yeah, and having spoken to a bunch of those women, they're often frustrated at how little influence they have right off the bat in terms of investment decisions, but hoping over time, 5 years, 10 years in, maybe they'll get to exert more influence.
And that's a problem with venture capital. It's a weird industry, right? It's they're small organizations, most of them, and they're really idiosyncratic. And if you look for best practices, there are no best practices. Like every venture capital firm seems to do things in their own kind of weird way. I mean, certain things become norms, but whether or not they're good norms. So it's it's an industry that women are trying to change, mostly by starting their own funds.
Yeah, because it's like almost like, who's doing the investing translates into what is being invested into. Just a couple more questions. Carla, can groups like the Rosalind Franklin Society with 5 Nobel laureates help to showcase and provide visibility for women entrepreneurs? Can peer-reviewed journals help with this visibility and credibility also, like Journal of Women's Health? Laura, would you like to take a stab at that?
I assume the answer to those specific questions are yes. Another thing that I would suggest as a way to give visibility is also journalism. So, there's a lot of women health reporters, and take a look at Jane Brody in the New York Times. She writes about women's health issues all the time. She writes about men's health issues too. And so just in terms of general awareness, I'd say that, that has significant impact.
Yeah, I think this goes back to the whole visibility, right, of women entrepreneurs that we discussed back when we were talking about Series A.
I mean, in terms of journals, right, sure, it'd be great to have more women-focused journals, but, JAMA, New England Journal, Lancet, those are the top of the heap. And so we want to get the women's health studies, women-led studies into those papers. And, if there's good science getting done and the right people involved, hopefully that can happen even more.
Right. So
and they should require diversity. I don't know if they do in their studies.
Yeah.
I mean, as a requirement of publication.
So just maybe a final question here. I'm going to ask everybody to get their crystal ball out. And where would you see this space in the next 5 years in terms of investment, technology adoption, infrastructure to support these technologies? Where do you think we're going to be in 5 years from now? Karen, start with you.
Sure. Well, I had mentioned the menopause area. As you look at where wealth is accumulated in this country, an awful lot of it is held by women. And women historically have put more of their resources to philanthropy than to investment. And groups are trying to change that, whether it's becoming an LP in a fund or investing in other ways. But we as women can have a big impact on where those dollars get invested. And some of that momentum has started. So I think we will see that people who are making the investments are making more and more demands in terms of where money is spent. We also have an expectation. I don't know, just thinking about my mother, when things came up for her from a health perspective, her response was to just basically stay home and not have to deal with it. Well, I don't want to stay home. I want to be active and engaged. And if I've got health issues to deal with, I want there to be solutions that help me stay active and mobile and other things. So I think there's a different expectation. And as you look at generations that are coming up behind me, I think the expectation is even more accelerated. We're going to see more and more of these high deductible health plans where people are getting much more aware of what their money is funding, is they have to cover X thousands of dollars themselves before a health plan will kick in. And that engagement in personal health, expectations around quality of life will have a big impact on where we see investment dollars and even in the 5-year period, but certainly longer.
I'm really hopeful that, I don't think it's going to be a rocket ship, but I think we're going to keep making progress. I see it already, and it's, and the more entrepreneurs that are out there with great ideas, somebody will recognize them, and and the more exits we have in the space, again, as Laura mentioned, the more it'll drive investment in the space.
I guess to be an entrepreneur, you have to be really, really an optimist. And I'm hoping for the rocket ship. And I think there's a really good chance at it. Because, if you think about where there's been the most innovation over the last 10 or 20 years, we're now at that stage where we're seeing like the nth version, the slightly better stent, the slightly better, rod and screw for the back. By the way, there's nothing wrong with that. But, some of the stuff I'm seeing in women's health, these are huge unmet needs with real solutions, trying to sell to Karen's point, big markets where there's money. I think that's the ingredients for a rocket ship.
Laura, we will leave it at that and keep the last word as the rocket ship that's waiting to happen in this space. Karen, Linda, Laura, what an absolute pleasure. I've learned so much. I know the audience has as well. It's been terrific engagement. Thank you so much for taking the time to be on this panel. It was truly a pleasure, and really look forward to continuing this conversation and making sure that this unmet medical need is definitely met. So thank you so much. And Michelle, I will turn it back to you.
Thank you, Nishta. I want to thank our esteemed panelists and attendees for joining us today. We hope you found the discussion to be fruitful and engaging. And as I previously mentioned at the beginning of the webinar, today's recording will be available to view shortly. Thank you, everyone. Have a good afternoon and evening.